All right, well, I'm glad we got a bit of a break. It's great to be with you all again. I was here with you a couple of years ago talking about artificial intelligence, and I remember this kind of triathlon schedule in which there are no breaks between the talks, and you're dealing with physics and all sorts of stuff. And so it's really great to be with you. And I'm a little fear and trepidation because I know many of you are physicians and a lion's share of the rest of you are scientists. But what I want to talk to you about this afternoon, and I've actually readjusted the slides because I've been sitting back here in the back, and I don't know if it's my own eyes or not, but I have a really hard time seeing some of this stuff. So I've actually simplified the slides. So at the very least, I hope you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. And I've left most of the details about this off, at least except for enough to sort of explain illustratively. So let me tell you a bit about this book. So I co-authored this book. Came out in October of 2020 called The Price of Panic. And my co-authors are a statistician named William Briggs, who has spoken to this august group before, and a biologist named Doug Axe. And I had no intention of writing a book on the COVID-19 lockdowns, but this was one of these things that, these ideas that seize you and you realize, well, somebody's gonna have to do this. And as things sort of happened, I was deeply suspicious of what was happening come late March. And the thing that sort of made me think that the policy response to COVID-19 was going to be a disaster was my realization that the public health bureaucracy, starting with the World Health Organization and then the kind of national equivalents to that, were taking their guidance from a single untested predictive model out of the Imperial College London. And I thought, okay, this has all the details shaping up to be a disaster. I had no prior assumptions about the deadliness of a virus or about respiratory viruses or anything like that. It was as the details worked out that I became convinced, and my co-authors became convinced, that this was not going to go well at all. And so we decided to write a book so that we could at least take what we learned from the first lockdowns and we hoped contribute to the argument for not doing it again. So the book is primarily about two things. It's about this double contagion, and in fact, I think 50 years from now, historians will not be writing about the remarkable nature of SARS-CoV-2, about the virus. It's a fairly unremarkable virus. In terms of deadliness, it's comparable to the Asian flu of 1957-58, though it's much more specific in who it tends to make sick and kill. But what is historic, and in fact what is a first of its kind, is a simultaneous planet-wide social contagion. Prior to this time, historians know about social contagions, but they tend to be regional. And the sort of famous one is the Dutch tulip frenzy, in which a particular set of circumstances comes together, and what John Maynard Keynes called animal spirits causes people to respond in a way that's fairly irrational if you're looking to it from the outside, and respond in a way that they would not respond if they were just sort of out in the state of nature by themselves. So because we're not just individuals, we're also social creatures. We tend to do things for mimetic reasons, so we tend to pick up signals from our fellow human beings. Sometimes we can be carried away by the social contagion. So we actually think it's the double contagion. That's a part of the story, and the social contagion will ultimately be more significant than the viral contagion. So we actually, let me tell you the assumption we started when we started working on this book. So this is something I would actually never recommend doing what we did. So we worked on a book proposal in March, so it's three of us. Briggs was in Taiwan, believe it or not. He'd flown from New York to Taiwan, working, doing statistics for the medical system of the Republic of China in Taiwan, and got trapped there because he couldn't go back to New York where he lived. My other co-author, Doug Axe, was in California, obviously trapped there and tormented, and I was in the Washington, D.C. area. And so we decided, okay, we're gonna try to write this, and if we can get the publisher, Regnery Publishers, to take it, we'll do it, because I knew they could probably turn the book around in 3 months. Most sort of genuine publishers can't do that, even in 6 months, and usually takes them 12 months. And so within a week, we actually had a book contract, and we're working on this book on April the 1st. Now, we had to turn it in June, which is daunting, but I can tell you, I was actually genuinely helped. All of us were helped by the lockdowns themselves. So normally I have a commute to Catholic University. I have a kind of active speaking schedule. I'm traveling around. I have to go to meetings constantly. Their faculty meetings all got canceled. So I benefited from the lockdowns and used the time I saved from the lockdowns to write a book complaining about the lockdowns. So I'm one of the sort of lucky people, and probably a lot of us in this room, that are actually able to digitize our jobs. So the stuff that I actually do as a professor, I was actually able to do mostly online, and I actually saved time as a result of this. Now, if you run a Mexican restaurant, or you're a housekeeper, or you wash dishes in a restaurant, you can't digitize that, right? And so the lockdowns very preferentially harmed the people who could least afford it and could least leave with it. And so that's honestly, that was what inspired us to write the book. It almost killed us, but we were able to do it in real time over Google Docs. And the whole time we were actually in 3 different time zones spanning 18 hours, but we're able to do it with the wonders of technology. So let me give you kind of a summary of, one, our diagnosis, and then what we knew as of late May about the effects of the lockdowns. Our initial assumption was that what we were going to find is that the lockdowns had some marginal benefit, but that their costs vastly outweighed the benefits. What we found is actually much more depressing than that. And I think because of what we found and what the intervening months have confirmed, is the reason that almost no politicians are willing to tell the truth about this. No politician that is going to ever be elected again has an incentive to say, okay, you know that stuff we did a few months ago that destroyed millions of jobs and depressed lots of people and caused people not to be able to get their cancer screenings in hospitals? It didn't do any good. Right? No politician's going to want to say that. And so as a result, we've got this disparity between what we can, I think, fairly clearly show statistically and what the kind of officials are actually willing to say. So what happened? If we're talking about the social contagion, how do we account for the fact that you could say, okay, maybe in the United States, well, the media hated Donald Trump so much that they were absolutely committed to panic porn 24/7. And if you get trapped in the United Club like I did the other night and CNN is on and you can't escape from it, they're still at this 20-something months later, right? Even though Joe Biden is the president. But even if you were to explain everything in terms of the politics of 2019 and 2020, this was a global phenomenon, right? And so there's something, we somehow have to explain the fact that the contagion was global and is a lot worse in certain parts of the Anglosphere. So they have released the army in Australia in the last 24 hours because people are not complying with lockdowns. And so, right, so the media's hatred of Donald Trump doesn't have anything to do with what's happening in Australia. We are dealing with the first simultaneous planet-wide social contagion. Well, there was a poll just about this time last year, it was actually July of 2020, called the COVID Opinion Tracking Poll. And it asked Americans to guess what percentage of the total population had died from COVID-19 as of the middle of July. So we're talking about sort of 3.5 months of tracking this, right? So I won't ask you to guess, but try to think, what do you think the average guess was? So there's just an average American guessing what percentage of the total population, right, had died. 10, 15, 7, 9% was the average guess. All right, so, I mean, you all know this is ridiculous. You're probably wondering what it is. So if you were to look at the CDC numbers, so this is what was utterly maddening, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this. You didn't necessarily have to appeal to nefarious motives. I very often found myself, just look at the CDC website. The ideas you have in your head are completely crazy, even if you trust the CDC. But of course, nobody did that. That takes 2 or 3 minutes, right? And I was just looking at the CDC website, and it's intentionally written, I'm convinced, in order to be impenetrable and indecipherable by the average person, right? So they've just announced that they're going to remove the emergency authorization for this particular PCR test that's been being used for the last year and a half, because if you read it, this was just announced on the CDC website. So the translation is that it doesn't do a good job of distinguishing the flu and COVID-19 and seems to generate false positives. Now, most of you probably already knew this, right? And the CDC has said we're going to withdraw the authorization for the use of this test now during the next COVID season because it's sort of not accurate. But I'm telling you, try to read the 3 paragraphs where they explain this. You'd have absolutely no idea what it's talking about unless you already sort of knew the discussion. And so this is the difficulty. And so where did people get this impression? 9%. This is the right answer, by the way, at the time in July, just from the CDC numbers, 0.06%. So that's not the infection fatality rate. That was the percentage of the population. And that's even probably too high. But that's just, if you went to the CDC website at the time, this is what you would have discovered. So people thought it was 150 times more deadly than it was according to the CDC. How is this possible? What caused the panic? And I think that's the sort of interesting question here. If we don't know the answer and we don't figure out what the answer is, we actually have very little prospect of being able to prevent it from happening again. Well, I think it's actually several things. Part of it is surely just the fact that the origins of this virus were scary. So it came, we know, very quickly from Wuhan, this sort of industrial center in central China. There's scary things that have come from this part of the world in the past. This is the People's Republic of China we're talking about, so everyone knew, we don't necessarily know if we can trust what they say. In fact, we can be fairly certain that we can't trust what they say. We also know that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was right there in Wuhan. The State Department, just a mere 2 years before, had issued a report saying that, even though this is a level 4, so the sort of most tight security virology lab that you can have, stuck for some reason in the middle of a population center, right? That alone ought to tell you something weird's happening. But the State Department said their security is lax. We also know that they use the relevant bats that this virus is associated with. But of course, we weren't allowed to entertain the possibility that there was a connection between those two things, right? So this alone is sort of strange because the mind immediately says, okay, there's a few really plausible hypotheses here for where this virus came from, right? Just go, maybe it came from an animal and we'll find some precursor animals and it came from this bat that's not from Wuhan, but it passed its way, through various mutations and it eventually became, infectious to human beings. And so that seems like, okay, that's a possibility, right? That's the kind of thing that could happen. But clearly the other one is that it came from the lab. And yet we were told immediately that only crazy people and conspiracy theorists are allowed to entertain that, right? And so, look, this is just logic at this point. We're just dealing with philosophy of science. You've got multiple competing hypotheses. Let's look at the evidence. If you're told immediately, oh, you're not allowed to entertain one of these, people get the sense that something's up, even if you're not sort of inclined toward conspiracies. This is almost like I thought, are they trying to get us to believe conspiracies with this stuff? And I'm happy to say that the book came out in October, and we said in October, before it was cool to say, that this probably leaked from the lab. Can't prove it, couldn't prove at the time that it was done with gain-of-function research, but that's what we actually thought. But the reality is that just the origins of this thing alone, I think, made it scarier than it would be. But what really, I think, enhanced this, because if you remember in January, in fact, in late January, and President Trump actually ordered restrictions on travel from China, remember, he was attacked at the time for being xenophobic, right, by official people that within a few weeks would change their tune. But early on, right, in January and February, Fauci and various people were telling us, don't worry about this. Well, this all changed with the release of a model, or at least the results of the model, from a team of 30 affiliated with the Imperial College London, led by this guy, Neil Ferguson. Now, last week, I was actually with the other Neil Ferguson, spelled differently, who is the historian of finance that is now at the Hoover Institution and is a conservative. And so he has a book out now actually called Doom. And so we were talking about this, and I kept having to tell people at the conference, I'm not talking about this Neil Ferguson over here. This is a different guy. But now this guy, this Neil Ferguson, NEIL, if you look him up, he has a 20-year record of making these kinds of predictions about the swine flu and SARS-1 and the bird flu that are orders and orders of magnitude more catastrophic than they actually turn out to be. I mean, at the level of hundreds of millions of people will die and 200 die. I mean, that level of error. And yet he never seems to have been harmed in his career in the least by doing this. And so that alone, that's sort of a case study in how strange the public health bureaucracies have gotten. But this is the model, right, that predicted, or that claimed, right, as the media calls it, they discovered or predicted that 2.2 million Americans would die unless there were drastic non-pharmacological interventions, including lockdowns. Now, this is a non-representative sample of the population, Doctors for Disaster Preparedness. So most of you, if not all of you, are aware of the dangers of predictive computer modeling. They can be good, right? But by themselves, all a model is a really sophisticated statistical model that you run on a supercomputer, and it can't ultimately tell you anything except what you told it to say. You've got the propositions, you've got the assumptions you plug in. So what's the infection fatality rate of this bug? What are people doing? How many people are together? How infectious is it? You make all these kinds of assumptions, then you run it, and then it tells you something. Now, it might be a surprise to you to discover the implications of your assumptions, but all you've generated at this point is the implications of your assumptions. For the model to be useful, of course, you got to test it against the data. And so that's what you would want to do in this case. So you would not want a predictive model to be used for guiding public health policy prior to it being tested. But that's exactly what we did. And in the model, they assumed, based on some patchy information from a flight from China, I'm not making this up, that the infection fatality rate was 3.4%. And from this, it discovered that meant that 2.2 million Americans would die within about 3 months without massive interventions. Now, we know how important this is because in April, when President Trump was also advocating lockdowns, reporters asked him, why did you do this? And here's what he said. He said, 2 very smart people came into my office and they told me, Mr. President, if we don't lock everything down, 2.2 million people are going to die in this country. That's the exact number. Right? Now remember, so this went from a computer model to the president's ears in a series of weeks, this exact number, based entirely on the assumption of an infection fatality rate that no one knew the answer to at the time. All right, so that fact, that kind of information trajectory and the capacity of what is in effect 3 or 4 people, this is what we call the tyranny of experts, to whisper in the ear of important politicians and get them to change historic course and policy in their country, that's a very, very dangerous thing. And that's what we've seen. Well, now, if it had just been this computer model, because there were other people modeling, there was the IHME at the University of Washington and some other people running these things. Why this model? Why was this one so significant? As I said, it wasn't because Neil Ferguson has such a stellar record of getting these things right. It's because this man heard about it. Now, this man is Director General Tedros from Ethiopia. He is the Director General of the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization, most of you know, is the public health arm of the United Nations, which came into existence with the original charter for the UN in 1948. So it's been a part of the UN's mission from the very beginning, was to focus on public health. As it happens, the Director General of the World Health Organization is a longtime member of the Ethno-Communist Party of Ethiopia. That's, again, this sounds made up, right? Doesn't this sound like one of these bad apocalyptic novels from the 70s? And he's still a member of this ethno-nationalist party. This is the guy that is in charge of global public health. And in fact, the American foreign policy analyst Gordon Chang said Tedros is the second to last person who should be heading the World Health Organization. And he said the last person is Chinese President Xi Jinping. Right. So this is just, if you're going to pick, from the constellation of the human population, this is like the second to last guy you would actually want in charge of this. And if you read about his early aspirations, he sees public health as a means to social change. And in fact, the thing that I discovered, the kind of key takeaway that I discovered in working on this book, was that the public health bureaucracy is far more about social change and social control and politics than it is about, say, healing people and protecting people from malaria and disease. Yeah, of course, that's a kind of a part of the package. But if you don't understand that politics is what public health is about, I don't think ultimately you understand what public health is about as a discipline. Now, we're not exactly sure who the two very smart people were. We know that one was Dr. Anthony Fauci. We also were able to figure out that the other one could not have been Dr. Deborah Birx. And so I can't prove this, but I would bet money that the other person was the director of the NIH, Francis Collins. So two men who talked to Director General Tedros, who had read the computer model, were told this, believed it, told the President of the United States, so the most powerful man in the world, who was philosophically inclined to think, okay, I don't want to shut the economy down, right? But was told, science, trademark, capital, all caps, right? Science, trademark, all caps, tells us 2.4 million Americans will die, or 2.2 million Americans will die if you don't do this stuff. So that is an absolutely crucial part of this. If there had not been this information chain from a predictive model through the public health bureaucracy to influential politicians, and things like this happened in other countries. I'm just telling the part because we're in the United States. That's how it happened here. But then, of course, you also have the media promotion. I suspect that most of you had never heard the name Anthony Fauci 2 summers ago, unless maybe if you had followed the AIDS epidemic and that sort of thing, you might have known who he was. Most people had never heard the name of Anthony Fauci, even though it turns out he's the highest paid employee of the federal government. He's been in the federal government for about as long as I've been on the earth. And so that's a long time, and I'm not that young of a guy. So he has been at this for a long time. But the fact that he was immediately made this celebrity by the media tells you something, right? Because what he was initially, if you remember, a president is elected, he has political appointees, but he inherits the permanent administrative state. So it's not like President Trump hired Anthony Fauci, just you have a pandemic. Who do you talk to? Well, this is the guy I'm supposed to talk to, right? So he inherits him, and he's sort of just trapped. But normally, the job of a politician is to exercise prudential judgment, so he's going to listen to the advice of several policymakers, and so he might have, okay, this is the immunologist, right? Okay, and this is my economist guy, and this is the guy that's in charge of the hospitals, and then you have the president weighs those bits of advice, and then it's his job to make a prudential judgment about what policy, given all this, the costs and the benefits, what's the most prudential judgment. As it happened, though, Anthony Fauci was removed from that sort of constellation of presidential advisors and elevated so that he became the incarnation of science itself. Now, that might sound like an exaggeration, but let me prove it to you very quickly. What happened if another scientist, say from Oxford or Harvard or Yale or the Stanford Medical School, decided, I don't think Anthony Fauci quite has that right, and decided to talk about it on YouTube? They got pulled, right? Now, you all know that being a scientific bureaucrat, that's not like winning the gold medal of science, right? It's not like, okay, who's the smartest person in this field? Well, it's going to be whoever happens to be working for the federal government. That makes absolutely no sense. If you're at Stanford Medical School, you're perfectly capable of analyzing the data just as well as this guy. But what happened is that officialdom came to stand in for science itself. And the problem is that official scientific bureaucrats have a particular set of incentives. And frankly, every smart politician should know this going in. if you're, say, in charge of public health and the president asks you what we should do, you're not going to say, it's probably fine, don't worry about it. Because imagine you say maybe 50 people will die and 1 million people die. That's really bad for your pension, right? For your retirement. On the other hand, if you say 1 million people will die unless we do X, Y, and Z, and 1,000 people die, one of two things. It's a good thing we did all that stuff, right? Look at all those people we saved. Or, well, better safe than sorry. So you can see the incentive is always going to be to list toward catastrophe. But if you're an independent scientist, you're going to be just trying to look at the data. And so if anything, when you're outside that system, you're probably more likely, all things being equal, to be able to give it a dispassionate analysis. And really wise politicians would know that, but I'm pretty sure that politicians are not taught this. So far as I can tell, one prominent American politician figured this out. Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. He figured this out within a few weeks. And so 1 of 50, basically. I mean, so this is really bad batting average, right? It's a very, very, very rare skill. So we have this massive media promotion in which a scientific official comes to stand in for science and becomes the kind of infallible arbiter of science. And then you have the social media boosting that I think was absolutely crucial, because you had this same kind of dynamic in which the media are always incentivized toward catastrophe because we're interested in it. That's the whole point of the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads. No one wants to hear another great day in the United States of America. You're not going to watch that, right? That's not breaking news. And so there's a natural incentive for the media to cause us to panic. But by itself, I think television, you're sort of just watching it periodically, wouldn't be that significant. But this is the first major pandemic that we've had in which there's almost universal social media and smartphone penetration among the peoples of the developed world, and a significant percentage of people in the so-called developing world. 2009, we had an epidemic, but remember that iPhone only came out in 2007. So most people were not carrying around HD video screens that access the rest of the internet and all these other devices at roughly the speed of light on their bodies. But in 2019 and 2020, somebody could be walking around Shanghai and see an elderly man fall over and die on the street, videotape it, post it on Instagram. 2 hours later, you see it on Twitter, and then CNN is reporting it a couple of hours later. That's instantaneous. Turns out that man dying or falling over on the streets in China probably had nothing to do with COVID, but it immediately came to symbolize this is how deadly this virus is. It causes people to just collapse on the street, right? That's the kind of power of social media boosting of regular kind of media impressions. The former health minister of Israel said this was the first virus with public relations. It was absolutely relentless when you watch this. And this, I think, it was the combination of these things that led to a global pandemic panic. This is the crucial thing. And so what I actually think was happening is a series of kind of natural incentives of a public health bureaucracy, which has gotten very, very large and very unaccountable, with too much access to influential politicians, which was elevated by the media and then magnified and amplified by social media, that led to the first and almost certainly not the last global social contagion. Our brains simply aren't adapted for this type of sort of transmission of global information. And so that's what I think is happening, and that's what we have to figure out. Okay, how are we going to adapt in the future so that we're not constantly being sort of pulled around by this? Well, of course, there were the kind of details of the science, right? And this also played a role. Most of you certainly remember the campaign around this. In fact, in the White House, it was called 15 Days to Flatten the Curve. This is a version of an image. There's a bunch of versions of this, but this is a mock-up from the version that was in Vox magazine online that President Obama tweeted or retweeted to his 77 million followers. And the idea, if you don't think about it really carefully, is actually really plausible. So the idea, this is a new virus. we're not going to be able to stop people from getting it ultimately, but so some amount of people are going to die or get sick from this virus. But if everyone, because it's a new virus, hits the healthcare system all at once, we'll get a lot of excess deaths of people that could have been saved, but because the hospitals are overrun, they would die. So the idea is, okay, we're going to implement, we're going to do some things that we wouldn't otherwise do, including lockdowns, including making people not go to church, people can't go to work, people can't go to school, but we're just going to do it for a couple of weeks to try to slow down the rate of infection temporarily. But notice even on this image, it's the same area under the curve. So the image concedes that, okay, the same number of people are going to get it. The idea is that we'll just slow it down a little bit, spread it out, so that everybody doesn't hit the healthcare system at once, and then fewer people will die, right? And so by itself, if you don't know anything else, that sort of has a plausibility to it, does it not? But notice the assumption here about the lockdowns. Where did this idea of lockdowns come from? Do any of you remember this ever being tried before? Anyone proposing lockdowns? For hundreds of years, the way we respond to respiratory viruses is with quarantines. Quarantines is where you take people that you know are sick and you isolate them from people that aren't sick. And maybe you even isolate them together. And then maybe you have special protection for people if you figure out there's certain people that are more susceptible to this, then you isolate them. But you don't lock everyone down together. In fact, in some ways that's counterintuitive because respiratory viruses tend to be worse in the winter in part because we're locked up inside together. So this very idea that lockdowns would be the response to this, where did this come from? It's actually kind of a long and really depressing story, and it actually started with a high school science experiment by a daughter of a scientist at Sandia National Laboratories. I'm not making this up. This is where the idea came from. She did a simulation of what lockdowns would do for the spread of influenza in her school. Again, it was just a simulation. Her dad liked it, thought this is cool. He got another person. They ended up co-authoring a paper on this in a CDC journal, and this slowly worked its way through the public health bureaucracy in the 2000s under President George W. Bush. But it still hadn't been tested in any significant way. So this was sort of a hypothesis waiting to be tested, and 2020 was the test. See what lockdowns do. And in fact, the effects of lockdowns were one of the assumptions in Neil Ferguson's model. He assumed the efficacy of the lockdowns and how efficacious they would be as one of his assumptions, one of these non-pharmacological interventions. Again, something that had not yet been tested, based entirely upon assumptions. So you might wonder, okay, so what was the prior evidence for lockdowns? That is, for the benefits of the lockdowns. As it happens, the World Health Organization in October of 2019 did a meta-analysis of the literature on this question. They focused on the flu because, of course, at the time we didn't know about COVID-19. And so here's the name. It's still up on the website as of yesterday. I assume at some point they're going to try to bury this, but you can still find it. Non-pharmacological, pharmaceutical public health measures for mitigating the risk and impact of epidemic and pandemic influenza. You know what the conclusions are? Population-wide mask wearing probably doesn't make a difference. Massive lockdowns rather than quarantines probably doesn't make a difference. And the costs would be so dramatic that it would be crazy to do it. That's the World Health Organization in October of 2019. Said there's no data that this would actually be useful. And yet we did it anyway. So that's depressing, but it's not the most depressing thing. Because at least before they said there was no data, but we realized, that's why we decided to do this book, that very quickly we would have data to figure out whether the lockdowns made any difference or not. Now, because the sort of cause and effect get complicated in cases like this, if you are really deeply committed to the effects and the values of lockdowns, you can always sort of adjust the hypothesis to explain away any particular data point, right? But let's assume that we would like this idea that lockdowns are effective to be testable. So if it's testable, we should be able to detect their effects. And the nice thing about the lockdowns is that the government-imposed lockdowns in various US states happened on particular dates, and in various countries happened on particular dates, and we know what those are. We also have case curves in these various places. And so you can figure out what you do here is you just take the case curves, right? You map onto that the date of the lockdown. Now it's a little complicated, but basically to see the effects of the lockdowns, there's going to be a lag of about 10 days having to do with, having to develop it, the time it takes to be tested. So what you would expect if the lockdowns made a difference is that about 10 days out from the date of the lockdown, if the curve's going up, right, and cases are still increasing, you should expect a bend downward in the curve. That's what you would predict if the lockdowns were effective and their effects were observable. Now we do all this in the book, so this takes up pages, but it's sort of tedious to have on a slide in a forum like this. So let me just give you a couple of examples of what this looks like. The UK was actually the perfect test case because they started out with a policy like Sweden, and then they instantly turned on a dime 180 degrees and became really draconian in the lockdowns, and it happened on a particular date. And so we've got this kind of a perfect test case to see, okay, did the lockdowns make any difference? I stripped this down so it looks simple, but you get the basic idea here. So it's obviously a logarithmic curve. You've all seen these curves. So the little lock, that's the day that the government imposed lockdown. The first one went into place in the UK. 10 days, the 10 is 10 days out from that. Now notice you would have absolutely no idea where those 2 points are if I took them off. You couldn't look at that curve and say, oh, it's here. In fact, and if you were trying to guess, you'd probably guess in the wrong place. There's just no sense, any signal at all in the noise. Now that's the UK. And if you look at the US states, again, the nice thing about the states is we've got dates. We've got some states that locked down, some states that didn't, some that locked down quickly and then quickly reopened. And so you could actually run this stuff. And so we did it. I'll just give you one example, but if you've seen one, in some ways you've sort of seen them all. This is the state of Georgia. All right, so ignore that second vertical line. It's not crucial. What you want to see here is that Georgia, where the lockdowns happen, see the lock. Look 10 days out, slightly to the right. That's 10 days out, so that's where you would expect the curve to start varying, right? Now there's a lot of noise in this, obviously. The great thing about Georgia is that they reopened fairly quickly, and you can remember because if you go to CNN on that date, and you could just do a search for that date, CNN will assure you that there were going to be bodies in the streets and mass death in Georgia because of the reopening. Now look 10 days out from the reopening. There's just nothing. Right? Now this is utterly depressing in some ways because what we were expecting to find is that, okay, the lockdowns, they made some difference, but the cost was so dramatic that that's going to sort of weigh negatively against it. What we found, and what we found now in spades, is that there's no detectable effect of the government-imposed lockdowns at all on cases or hospitalizations or deaths. That doesn't mean that there's nothing that anyone did that made any difference. So what we suspect happened, and there is some suggestion in some of this data that people's kind of immediate personal and voluntary responses probably made a difference, right? So in other words, if you think about it, everyone has their own local knowledge. And so if you find out there's a respiratory virus and you know you're really susceptible to respiratory viruses like I am, I've had pneumonia twice and had complications, then you're probably going to change your behavior. Or if you hear about this virus and you feel like your throat's hurting, you're probably not going to go out or you're going to go to the doctor. And so it's not like behavior modification doesn't do anything. It's just that local knowledge does about all the good that you can expect to have happen. And these government-imposed lockdowns, because they're just sort of sledgehammers, utterly arbitrary, usually imposed after the fact, end up not having any effect. And in fact, they might have even had to sort of be contraindicated because it may be that locking people up and not letting them go to the gym actually caused some people to get sick that would not otherwise have been sick. It's sort of hard to know that for sure, but we can absolutely say that there's no detectable evidence that the lockdowns made any difference at all. So in other words, all pain and no gain. All pain and no gain. No policymaker is ever going to want to admit that unless he's about to retire and he's going to die next week and he knows it and he feels guilty maybe. I mean, right? I guess it could happen. Here's one other kind of example of this. It's probably hard to see, but so this is a histogram of deaths deaths per million, so single deaths per million for countries with at least a population of at least 1 million. So the dark lines, the dark vertical lines, for those of you who probably can't see this, those are the countries that did not have lockdowns. And then the light gray lines are the countries that did have lockdowns. And as you go from left to right, you get higher deaths per million, effectively. And so you can notice that actually the countries that didn't have lockdowns tend to cluster on the left. And so if anything, it's the countries that lockdown that tended to, on average, have greater deaths per million. Now, I think the problem is I wouldn't read this as saying the lockdowns killed more people, because there's so much complexity in the data. And so there's things that are very different about Northern Italy with its healthcare system and people that tend to have too much type 2 diabetes, and there's a lot of obesity. Whereas you get places like Taiwan, where my co-author William Briggs was, which did really well and didn't really even have lockdowns. And Vietnam, where people did really well. And so I suspect that there's just some kind of pre-existing immunity or something like that. But again, if the lockdowns made a difference, you would expect some sort of signal. Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you expect some signal that the countries that locked down tended to do better than those that didn't? And yet, not only is that not the case, it seems to have gone the other direction. So what that means is that there's all cost on one side and no benefit on the other. So what is the price of the panic? This is it's obviously a bit of a complicated thing to calculate, because you have to basically say, okay, what would have been the cost in lives and dollars to the global economy if we had not tried the lockdowns, if we had responded to COVID-19 just like humans have responded, say, for the last 100 years to pandemics like this. And so we'd done all the kinds of things that we normally do. It would have still been costly. And so we calculated it would have been something like $200 billion to the US economy if you just sort of reduce everything to dollars, even if we hadn't had lockdowns. So you have to subtract that from the cost with the lockdowns. So that's what we actually try to do in the book. So we mostly focused on the domestic situation, but here's one really depressing data point. So most of you know that since 1990, about 1 billion people worldwide in the developed world have emerged from absolute poverty, as the UN counts it, at $2 a day, from below it, sort of in absolute poverty to out of absolute poverty, right? It's not the result of anything the UN did. It's not the result of government planning. It's sort of trade liberalization, rule of law, innovation, things like that. Well, it turns out in 2020, according to the UN Food Program, so this is another UN office, they estimated, again using models, but I think it is fairly plausible. Here's what they said, and this was now a year ago, that the events of 2020 could plunge as many as 420 million more people into extreme poverty. This is what David Beasley, who's the executive director of the UN World Food Program, he predicted that shocks to the food supply chains could lead to 300,000 deaths per day. So the shocks to the food supply globally, all of us saw a few stories about this, but there were massive shocks to the food supply. We didn't sort of suffer massive food shortages, but if you think about it, if you're right on the edge, if say 60% of your income goes just to get food, and there's a shock to that, it can be utterly catastrophic. Of course, it's the same thing that Paul Dreesen was talking about earlier. It's the same thing with energy. Look, if you spend 1% of your income on energy and it goes to 2%, that's not going to transform your life. What if a third of your income goes to energy and now it's doubled? That can kill you. It's the same thing here. So you want to be very, very careful about implementing policies that shock the global food supply. And that's always, in any rational policy, is going to be weighed against the positives of the policy itself. Now let's assume that the UN overestimated by an order of magnitude, and it's only 30,000 extra deaths a day. It would still, very quickly, you could end up equaling the number of people dying from starvation that died from COVID-19. That's a bad policy. We estimate that the lockdowns cost the US economy about $1 trillion a month. Now, trillion still sounds like a lot of money to me. I mean, I know we're getting used to that, but that's a really significant amount of money. And of course, it's not the money that matters. It's the jobs and the lives and the rental payments and the school payments and the doctor's payments. Of course, there were about 41 million new jobless claims as of the middle of May. 3 months after the lockdown started. Now, many of those have sort of returned, but that doesn't count the tens of thousands of small businesses that ceased to exist, never to return. Then there's deaths of despair. One study early on predicted that 2020 would have 75,000 excess deaths of despair. So these are deaths from drug and alcohol overdose and suicides. I suspect that's very much an underestimation of that, but 75,000 deaths of despair. And then here's the big one: delays in treatment and diagnosis. Now, most of you remember, and some of you were probably affected by this, that part of the lockdowns was to end, or at least to suspend, so-called elective procedures. Now, the idea, again, was that they wanted hospital beds available for people that were suffering from COVID-19 and were symptomatic. When I first heard elective procedures, I'm not a doctor, and so I thought, oh, I guess that's sort of nose jobs and liposuction and stuff like that, right? No. Elective just means it's on the schedule. So you might have had a cancer screening or a cancer procedure, or in the case of our editor at Regnery, she had breast cancer a couple of years ago, and she needed to be screened every 6 months. She couldn't get screened. So she spent 9 months not being able to go to the doctor and wondering if she was back in remission. One estimate, actually, so there's one estimate is that something like 750,000 to 100 million, or 750,000 to 1 million cancer screenings were missed over the 9 months from March to the end of the year in the United States. Now, that didn't mean everyone that in that set would die, but it doesn't, if a significant percentage of those people that had cancer that would have been caught don't get caught and suffer and die, it wouldn't take many, and that's only cancer. That wouldn't take too many examples like that in which just missed disease screenings could equal or exceed the deaths from COVID-19 in 2020 because of the lockdowns. This is a catastrophe. And then that's not even counting the sort of miscellany of costs that I don't even know how to tabulate. So what about kids, mostly poor kids in public schools that either didn't go to school or were pretending to go to school and they were at home, sixth graders sitting on Zoom? Now, I can tell you as a college professor, teaching college students on Zoom, that's tough. Very tough. And in fact, within 2 weeks, I actually had a guy, it turns out he wasn't a member of my class, but I had this one big class, and he was sitting on the edge of his bed during this Zoom class, drinking Pepsi in a so-called wife beater tank top. And he's sitting there, I thought, who is this guy? I don't recognize him. He's got a cap on. And then about halfway through the class, he started drinking Jack Daniels out of the bottle. I thought, this guy's not going to be a student at Catholic University very much longer. And then at the end, he started smoking a bong on screen, right? And so we looked at it, my research assistant afterwards, we had recorded it, and she looked at it and she said, this guy wasn't even a member of your class. He just got the Zoom link. And so the whole school had to implement security protocols because of this. But this is happening in college. Now imagine what was happening with third graders and fourth graders on Zoom. There just wasn't any learning happening. It was a disaster, and we're getting some data about what's happening now. I can tell you, so my daughter went to a nice liberal arts private school that kept meeting very quickly, or was maybe locked down for a few weeks, set up a system of individual tutorials, and then starting in September, they were back in class. Washington, D.C. public schools, they weren't in class. So again, there's this kind of massive differentiation between the people that can afford private schools or homeschoolers and the people that were stuck in inner city public schools. The cost of that, the cost of not being able to go to church, not being able to go to mass. The sheer depression of not being able to do your job, but that doesn't maybe necessarily result in suicide or drugs, but nevertheless is a real cost. And then I think in some ways the ultimate cost, the cost of freedom. This is in some ways the weirdest thing about 2020. Neil Ferguson, when he first released the model, he said, it's unfortunate, but we had assumed that we noticed the positive effects of lockdowns, but that was following the Chinese model. But we were afraid, the rest of the world's not going to go in for the way the People's Republic of China does this. We did. We complied. Right? It was absolutely extraordinary. Now you would expect, imagine somebody had told you, say in 2019, okay, the government is going to tell us in 2020 that most people aren't to report to work, you're not allowed to go to church, you're not allowed to go to synagogue, and your kids aren't allowed to go to school. Now you would assume, okay, people would rise up, not necessarily violently, but there would be massive protests. People on the left would be talking about fascism. People on the right would be talking about the First Amendment and freedom and all this kind of stuff. It didn't happen. And this is the mystery. Why did this not happen? I think it was because of the kind of moral jujitsu that took place. So normally when you imagine that scenario, you're imagining you're being told you can't go out to your job or to church for your own good for some reason, or just because the government's overweening in its power. But that's not how it went. Instead, we're told you might be fine, but you could go to church, carry the disease asymptomatically, cough, and make the old man in front of you sick and kill him. So even if you wouldn't do it for yourself, you need to do it for the least of those among you and for your fellow human beings. Most of us, including me, how do you respond to that? How do you respond to that? That's the kind of moral jujitsu that I think got us in this position in which we essentially complied with, in many cases, kind of undignified things that we were asked to do that most of us knew made absolutely no difference, right? And yet we did it anyway because it's just sort of uncomfortable not to do it. That's the kind of loss of freedom, and that's significant. It wouldn't be that big a deal if this was a one-off. But trust me, every person in power that would like to retain and maybe even increase their power noticed this. They noticed that the American people overwhelmingly comply when told that they need to do it for the good of other people. Now that's good that we are motivated altruistically that way, but it's bad that those who would like to control us now know that they can use that against us. And that's going to be the thing that we're going to have to claw back if we don't want to have to pay that massive price. And at the moment, I honestly have no idea what to say about whether we will get that back or not. On the one hand, I can tell you I live in a sort of a very left-wing little hamlet that's just outside Washington, D.C. in Maryland. And my neighbors, at least half of them, are all still utterly terrified. They're still putting their 5-year-olds in masks outside when it's 95 degrees, as if they don't know anything about the effects of this virus on children. Right? It's half the population. But then there's another part of the population that's sort of woken up and has realized what's happened. And there was a glimpse of this already last year in July of 2020. Some of you may remember Mayor Eric Garcetti of Los Angeles announced that he was going to cancel the official Los Angeles fireworks and was not going to allow anyone to do any private fireworks. Well, a few million Los Angeles had other ideas. There's an amazing drone footage of the Los Angeles skyline that goes on for miles. This is I think it's a 35-second extended exposure image of the fireworks. These are private fireworks, right? So this was the spirit of independence that existed in the hearts even of Californians in Los Angeles County in 2020. And it was these kinds of nonviolent reassertion of rights and freedom that still, I think, can give us some hope. Thank you very much.
Okay, really excellent. I mean, I have to applaud, along with everyone else, your presentation. 2 quick notes. One is, in my county, I sent to the public health director, who was not inclined to shut down the schools, you know, the normal traditional public health approach to influenza, an article that was published, Nature Medical Letters, estimating clinical severity of the COVID in China. And this was the group that had initially estimated 3%
right.
infection fatality risk. Then it dropped to about 1% or so.
Yeah.
1.4.
Right.
And then it's continued to drop.
It has.
And they were very good in that article saying, gee, we don't want to rush into these very dramatic changes in social mobility without knowing what the true infection fatality risk was.
Yeah.
And the public health director said, very interesting article, I just got word that we have to shut down because the public health director for the state,
right,
and this is in California, determined that there had to be shut down. So you have a lot of, I think, a traditional public health directors
Yeah.
who just had to go along
Absolutely.
with this. So the other point is a question. I encourage people to look at the Pfizer study published in the first week of December. This is a remarkable study, double-blind randomized studies. And I think in response to the jujitsu, you always say,
Right.
what do double-blind randomized studies? So 44,000 participants,
Right.
random, stratified, selected based on, socioeconomic balance. 22,000 in the control, 22,000 in the experimental group got 2 Pfizer shots,
Right.
or they got 2 placebos. They run it, and how many people died from COVID who got the Pfizer vaccine? 0. How many people in the control group, 22,000,
Right.
died of COVID? 0. They died of MIs, CVAs, cancer, not one COVID. How many serious COVID illnesses as defined in that study? The people who got the Pfizer vaccine, 1 or 2.
Yeah.
What were the number in the control group? 22,000. 9. So my question is, that frames, with the double-blind randomized study, the likely severity. Now, there's some complications, but how come we're not looking at these double-blind randomized studies to help frame the risks?
Well, some of them, of course, is that we didn't have it initially. So, you couldn't run these sort of things initially. But what did happen, as you're right, is that the infection fatality rate estimate kept going down. And we estimated it, again, we had to finish the book in the summer. It was between 0.13 and 0.25 is where that was the estimate. And that's about where it's been. And it's on the low end of that. And again, that we knew this within 3 months. That's what's so frustrating about this. But there were certainly, I had private conversations with people. You'd have sort of lower level public health officials, but the social pressure to conform on these things was so intense that only someone with force of personality like Ron DeSantis, I just can't say enough about him. He initially responded like everyone did, and then he immediately started contacting scientists that were literally on the front lines in Europe, found out, actually, it's people over 70 with multiple comorbidities, and we've got some nursing homes, we're gonna focus on that, we're gonna open up the economy, and then he just refused to, he was able to figure this out, and he had the kind of strength of conviction to be able to do it. But it turns out there just aren't very many politicians that are able to do that or have the capacity to. But you're exactly right. There's a lot of data on this stuff. Even eventually there's a lag, but even the CDC data, even if, you sort of take some of it with a grain of salt because I think they're overcounting, compared to what people thought was the case from the media, the CDC itself, right? I'm surprised they weren't getting blocked on Twitter, actually. It's maddening.
Hi, I'm Jim Enstrom from Los Angeles, and I've worked with Matt Briggs for over a decade. And you gave a fantastic talk, and you have a fantastic book, and we have a natural experiment going on right now in California for the next month and a half, because our governor has done excessive lockdowns and used extreme radicals for public health policy. And I would like to suggest separately, maybe a later dinner or something, ways in which you can get your book to have a big influence on the upcoming recall of the governor.
Oh, sure.
I think this is a fantastic opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd love to do that. Thanks.
I have a question. I'm wondering if you got into the fact that I've read like 80 to 90% of deaths happened because Dr. Fauci and his cabal, I'm sorry, that's what it is, refused to allow things like HCQ, ivermectin, that other countries effectively use. So this 550,000 deaths was highly overstated, overcounted, and unnecessary.
Yeah, and so we talked a little bit about that, and I have followed the ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and also the sort of vaccine stuff, though that sort of happened after the book came out. We didn't say so much about it just because we mainly wanted to focus on the lockdowns. It is really quite extraordinary, though, because it's clear to me that there's there's plenty of evidence that these interventions, especially ivermectin given early on, seem to have positive effects, and the cost of it, right, or so low. But there's no incentive, and most of you probably know this, but one of the conditions for getting emergency authorization of the vaccines was that there not be alternatives. And so there's a very strong incentive not to concede that there could be other alternatives that nobody has a financial incentive to promote. And so it's really utterly maddening that happened. It's going to be very hard to kind of account for, okay, what would the counterfactual be? But I do think, by the way, I got COVID in November of 2020, and so I had various sorts of things happen. And the idea that they were trying all sorts of stuff, giving people Pepsid and just things that might have some weird correlation, they'd try it, but they wouldn't give you ivermectin in the hospital. No way, couldn't do that. And so that's part of the weird kind of social hysteria that we were dealing with, that sort of basic commonsensical things could not be tried. And then, of course, the craziness in New Jersey and in New York early on, in which people that are in nursing homes or in the hospitals, they catch COVID-19 in the hospital and then get put back in the nursing homes. That was a massive percentage of the deaths in that part of the country from that policy. That's just purely a policy decision.
Millions of people worldwide have been using hydroxychloroquine for malaria prophylaxis,
Yep.
particularly in Central Western Africa and other places in Southwest Asia. Were you able to find anything in the data that looked like there was a beneficial effect for those people?
Well, we got lots of anecdotal data, and you're exactly right in Asia and Africa. So here's the confounding variables. Sub-Saharan Africa is very, very young. And so they use lots of anti-malarial medications, but they're also very young, relatively speaking, compared to sort of Northern Europe. And so it's hard to sort of, if you're just going to do the demographic analysis, a lot fewer deaths, but you say, okay, is this the result of the hydroxychloroquine? Is this the result of the fact that, they're decades younger on average? Or is it a combination? Or is it the fact that there's more sun, right? And so it's actually kind of hard to disentangle that, though I can tell you we had a lot of people who had managed to get hydroxychloroquine from some heretical doctor somewhere that were telling us, just, you guys got to talk about this, because I got well in 2 days and I was really sick. And so there was the kind of thing that look, in a situation like that, you should be able to trust doctors' clinical experience. And so of course there's going to be a lot of noise, there's going to be placebo effects and things like that. But when you're dealing with drugs that have such low risk and were so inexpensive that we would refuse to use them, to me, just is unconscionable.
Thank you, Dr. Richards, for your talk, and also for your mother-in-law, who referred my wife to a physician who does prescribe hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, et cetera, et cetera. We visited him 2 days ago, Thursday, and of his 290 patients who had come down with the virus, he treated them, and all of them survived.
Wow.
One of his patients got vaccinated. He promptly died 4 days later.
That's sad.
It's talking with one of our attendees at the meeting yesterday, and he's still in practice, and he's close to my age, but he's been very busy for the same reason. And of his 300 patients that came down with the virus, and he treated, all of them survived. Again, one of them took the vaccine, and he died 2 days later.
Oh, it's sad.
End of anecdotes.
Yeah.
Hi, how are you?
Great.
I just have an observation that predated the WHO, which was the 2010 Rockefeller Foundation war gamed out, a world pandemic. And which included enforcing a worldwide lockdown of healthy people, of everyone.
Right.
So, and you didn't really mention that in your book, but I think this is part of the Great Reset in a growth out of the WHO is a growth out of that, and this whole World Economic Forum and the Klaus Schwab and all this stuff I think has roots in the Rockefeller Foundation 2010 war game.
They certainly did war game it. You're exactly right. And we end the book referencing the Great Reset and Klaus Schwab, who what's funny about this is he's saying the quiet stuff out loud, right, on their website. It's like, this is a great opportunity, right, for us to reorder society. In fact, Anthony Fauci is saying exactly the same thing. And so in some ways, there's a question where you can say, okay, how much of this is the result of perverse incentives and social hysteria and people making bad choices, and how much of this did people sort of want to happen? The one thing we know is that now it having happened, they will have learned the lesson that we easily comply. And what's funny is if you notice Europe, we're not getting a lot of this news, but I see this stuff on Twitter. Hungary right now has hundreds of thousands of people are in the streets in Hungary today complaining about lockdowns. The media doesn't like to report this, but in some ways we've had it easy. Western Europe has been utterly draconian. What's weird is that there have not been massive protests in the United States against this. And I don't know if that's because it's been less bad or what it is, but at some point, I mean, the reality is if a little town just decided they weren't going to wear the masks anymore, it would be utterly unenforceable. These things are only enforceable because we comply.
Right. Well, and I think there's a more of a movement now in this country with people, deciding that, hey, it's my body, my choice. I'll wear a mask or not. I think we're kind of waking up. Anyway, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Hey, anybody wants to wear a mask, I'm perfectly free to let them do it. Just don't make me do it.
I loved it. You should be on TV more often. 2 questions. I've heard all kinds of things about the numbers of deaths are faked, phony, and I know 2 dental assistants who had to go for testing, waited 2 hours, got frustrated and left, and then got a report that they both showed positive.
I know, and so I heard a lot of these stories. I wasn't able to sort of chase any of them down. What we do know is that they're using this one test and overcycling it, so that almost certainly in many cases, you're not supposed to use these tests with people that are asymptomatic. This is a weird thing because usually what happens is you have symptoms and you say, I think I have this sickness, and then you go get tested, right? But if you're testing people that are asymptomatic and then you're making it way too sensitive, you're just bound to have massive numbers of false positives. So there's no doubt in our minds that, like, in terms of the cases, we're dealing with lots of false positives.
So when they say 600,000 dead, is it 300,000? Do you have any idea what
Okay, so in the deaths, the only way we're going to really be able to nail this down is in terms of excess deaths. It's the same thing with the flu. We don't count individual flu deaths. Basically, you count up all the other deaths for a year, and then the extras are basically flu and pneumonia. And so here's going to be the question, is sort of 3 years out. So this could be what happened, is that people that would have otherwise died of the flu, right, died of this, right? So everybody eventually ends up right at the edge, at the end of life, and then you die of something, and very often it's a respiratory illness. I have no doubt that unless I, stumble and trip in front of a bus, that's what I'll die of at some point. And so what that means is that, okay, is the virus, was it killing people that would have probably died within a few months from the flu? And so if so, you'd actually should see a dip back down. And so I think in sort of 2022, when we look at the excess deaths, we'll be able to, have a better sense of that. There's no doubt in my mind that some 6-figure number of Americans died from this. The question is whether or not, how many people that would have died. What you want to know is how many people died that would not have died within 12 months.
I'm going to chalk that up as we have no idea how many people just died of COVID.
No, we don't.
And the media is lying and bullshitting. Sorry, technical word.
Something like that. Yeah.
Okay. The other question is this. You mentioned the media many times.
Yes.
They are so full of it and so distorted.
Yep.
And they're just not, they don't get background checked. They're not registered.
Absolutely.
They don't have a permit, so we can't pull their credentials.
They don't have any.
I know. They make their own press badges.
Yeah, exactly.
So what can we do about that?
Well, we have to inoculate ourselves against them. There's no other way to do this, is to inoculate ourselves against the force of this, because I'm in DC, and so I'm around, so when you're dealing with these reporters, you're dealing with some 27-year-old with a journalism degree, and she knows nothing about the subject, and she just researched it for 2 hours.
I'm talking about Anderson Cooper and Lemon.
These guys.
These guys just lie right into the camera, interview people without asking valid questions, and it goes out to the world as if it's, kosher.
No, it does. If we treat it, if we treat these people as authoritative, they become authoritative. I think, remember, media means in between. Their job was supposed to be to mediate the information that we would not otherwise have and translate it for us. The media are, I think, own the lion's share of the blame for the catastrophe.
The lion's share of the blame. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Quick question, Jay. You have tremendous number of contacts as a result of the work you've done. A question off the wall, having been to New Zealand a dozen times.
Yep.
What's the end game, in your opinion, and you may not have one,
Right.
what is the end game in New Zealand?
I think massive social control that's going to be used for the climate change issue. I think what's going to happen is that climate change is going to be framed in terms of public health, and other things that seem tenuously related to public health will be framed in that way. Because remember, the argument is that you have to do this for the good of other people. Well, you can frame a lot of stuff. You can actually frame lockdowns for the flu in those terms too. And so I think, I think in New Zealand, I mean, it's a couple of islands. Same thing with Australia. The type of social control that's possible there is different from the type of social control in the United States. We've got this massive continent-wide country, and so I think that's what's happening. I honestly think they're sort of testing the waters for, okay, how much can we control the population for future aspirations.
Anyway, I agree with what you say. The question is, though, how do they start bringing outsiders in? What is the end game?
Well, again, New Zealand, as I mentioned, Australia has put the army into the streets, but the reality is that people are basically complying. I mean, all of these things, they don't require violence. It just requires simple civil disobedience. The problem is that people are not yet at the stage where they're willing to simultaneously refuse to comply. So individual people, right, that are usually sort of somewhere on the spectrum and are willing to do things that are contrary to social, sort of signals, they'll do it. But if you're one person not wearing your mask on the plane, they're just going to throw you off. It's completely ineffective. And so what has to happen is that people have to simultaneously decide that they're not going to comply, and then it's simply unenforceable. And most places have not yet reached that stage, unfortunately.
I think we have some other significant internal problems. I'm still a practicing physician, and last March, April of 2020, I started prescribing hydroxychloroquine, first for myself, my staff, then making attempts for friends and my own family, my children, et cetera, and that was shut down quickly. I was able to get it within a few days. It was shut down nationally. My daughter lives in Indianapolis. I started trying to get hydroxychloroquine then, but it was refused.
Was that from the pharmacists?
The pharmacists were refusing to fill it. And what happened in California, which is where I practice or try to practice, is that within months, the Medical Board of California said that licensees would be investigated if they prescribed hydroxychloroquine for non-FDA approved uses, which of course was COVID.
Yeah.
So it was stopped, and then the pharmacists stopped doing it. Now, I've also been prescribing as much as I can of the ivermectin, and that's beginning to get a lot of resistance from pharmacists. Many of them simply won't fill it anymore. I've still been able to get prescriptions for some of my patients and so on, using it prophylactically in some cases and actually therapeutically in others. Okay. So it's highly effective, as has been stated. And why there isn't this availability is striking. It is. It's unconscionable since it's around and it's safe, but there's a deeper motive going on here.
There is, and I mean, if you think about all of you physicians, how many drugs are used for off-label purposes, and it's perfectly fine. But in these particular cases, they had to clamp down on it. Yeah, so one more, I guess.
First, I want to say it's an excellent presentation.
Thanks.
There were some things that are missing that is the audience don't know. I'm a practicing anesthesiologist in Yuma, Arizona, and I have first-hand contact with the administration when they're providing data for us every week in the beginning of 2020 and then backed off. Two things they were providing, what they were calling as COVID cases and influenza cases. What I saw was the progressive non-reporting of flu cases, which is a flu season.
Yes.
And I asked the same question. I said, where did the flu cases go?
Right.
We are using PCR test by Dr. Carey Mullis, who said this test should not be used for diagnostic purposes.
That's right.
And there has not been an isolation of this COVID virus. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but there is no isolation in the United States, as far as I know, at this present time. So what are we comparing this pandemic against? If we have not isolated the virus, what is it that we are seeing? Are these influenza cases that are dying? Most people are not aware of the background weekly deaths that happen every week. They don't know. So there's been muddied of this data that's showing these deaths have happened without separating what is from the background deaths.
No, that's right. We don't walk around with the baseline of how many people die every week, and so it's absolutely
So
crucial.
people have come to believe that people don't die, or not that many, because they don't know what the baseline death is. So when the media puts out, oh, we had this many deaths this week, they don't know whether they would have died anyway, or is this from this cause. So there has been a lot of muddying and also silencing of physicians.
Absolutely.
I woke up myself and said, this is unreal. When physicians were talking about communicating what they're finding with each other, when places like social media, YouTube, Twitter, and other social media started censoring, deleting videos, you know that they're trying to hide something.
Yeah, absolutely. It's chilling. So there's one more. Hey, Craig.
Hey, Jay. How you doing?
Great.
I am one of those who've been trying to get the dang COVID virus. I don't social distance, don't get my shot and everything, but the thing's afraid of me, I'm convinced. Anyway, I did have the same concern that a lot of deaths were being switched around. You gave a figure of 0.06. I think at the beginning.
0.06, and that was just based on the CDC numbers at the time that were attributed to COVID.
Well, one of the things I figured they couldn't hide, I'd like you to comment on this, is that, the overall deaths, just period,
Total
in America.
deaths.
They could mix them around, but the overall deaths would be what they are.
That's right.
And if you look from 2016, 17, 18, 19, we usually go up about 50,000 a year, or maybe sometimes
from
100,000.
growth. That's right.
Last year, we should have gotten, if it had been a normal year, if you just look at the trend that's been for the last decade, around 3 million. But it did wind up being about 3.35 million, which is a pretty hefty bump.
It is, and so that's why I think at least some of those are excess deaths. And I think once we get a couple more years, we'll be able to see if it's anomalous.
The question I have, though, is how does that compare with other epidemics? I mean, it would seem to me in a given year that we have a major outbreak, that there would be years that it wouldn't necessarily go up normally.
That's right. 2013 was like that. It was an unusual spike. And then you have the Hong Kong flu in 67, 68, and the Asian flu in 57, 58. I think this compares to the Asian flu of 1957, 58. It's about as bad as that, probably.
Yeah, and I just throw that out for historical context because I think a lot of people would say, if they look at the last few years, yes, this is a big bump from what we had, but I think it needs to be compared to other such outbreaks, and that would, I think, put more context on it.
That's right.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Craig. Thank you all so much.
All right.